Good morning, everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cameron Brinitzer, and I'm chair of this distinguished panel. I entered the department as a PhD student in 2016 and just graduated this past August. I'm now a USC-Berggruen Fellow at the University of Southern California's Dornsife Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. As chair of this panel, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our eminent moderator and speakers, absolutely each of whom, whether they were aware of it or not, has been crucial to my own intellectual formation. So to start, our moderator is Sebastián Gil-Riaño, who also joined the department in 2016. So after briefly introducing each speaker, I'll hand things over to Sebastián, who will offer a few comments to orient our discussion. So our panelists this morning have been members of the department at different times, and completely overlapping in some cases, and I think as scholars represent a lot of the breadth and openness, rigor, and intellectual creativity of our department, and also maybe index some of the changes over time too. So to start, Lynn Nyhart completed her PhD in the department in 1986, and she's now the Robert E. Kohler Professor of History of Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. John Tresch taught in the department from 2005 to 2018, and he is now Mellon Chair and Professor of History of Art, Science, and Folk Practice at the Warburg Institute School for Advanced Study at the University of London. Jeremy Vetter completed his PhD in the department in 2005, and he is now an Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Arizona. Joanna Radin completed her PhD in the department in 2012, and she is now an Associate Professor of History of Medicine and History at Yale University, and also has a number of interesting other affiliations with the departments, which maybe we can talk about. And Mary Mitchell completed her PhD in the department in 2016, and she is now an assistant professor at the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies at the University of Toronto.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for those introductory remarks. And I should say, given that Cameron and I joined the department at the same time and have sort of spent equal time there, we will be dividing up the discussant duties, so we will be sort of taking turns working our way through the questions. And for our conversation this morning, what I did is I circulated a set of themes and questions which are intended to guide our wonderful panelists through our conversation on the state of the field. So I want to offer just some brief introductory comments that I hope will frame the stakes of this conversation. I think it's a really opportune time to be taking stock of the history of science and its future. Among other things, we're still grappling with COVID-19 and making sense of how it has altered our lives, our relations, and the structures of society. In public discourse, COVID-19 has been conceptualized as a great reset. I like the productive ambiguity of this term. Merriam-Webster defines reset as to set again or anew, implying two of our profession's stock and trade analytics, continuity, and change. The notion of a great reset also captures the existential dilemmas COVID-19 has raised for many of us. Does emerging from the pandemic mean continuing with the patterns we put on hold, or is it time to adopt new ones? The notion of a great reset could also be productively extended to our profession, which has also been inevitably altered by our recent history. So as we work our way through the sets of themes today, one of the larger questions that we might directly or indirectly address or encounter might be something along the lines of should we reset the history of science? Does this imply setting it again or setting it anew? I'm just going to say a little bit about the format of the panel. I've decided to call the panel a scripted conversation. So for each theme, our panelists will speak for 10 to 15 minutes in response to a set of questions that have been pre-circulated. And after we've addressed the first two themes, we'll take a pause and allow some audience members to weigh in, should they feel inclined. And then we'll tackle another set of themes, two more themes before another round of audience participation. Okay, so the first theme is really about the history of the field and its current state. And what I'd like the panelists to address, some of the questions I'd like to hear is, maybe it's more in a sort of biographical vein. What first drew you to the history of science, and what made you want to build your career in this field? What has kept you committed to the field, and why should we continue to commit to it? Has your sense of what it means to be a historian of science changed over time?
I was an undergraduate history of science major at Princeton. I graduated in 1979. I was attracted to, I wanted to do something interdisciplinary. I almost did American studies. But instead I did history of science because I liked the breadth of its interdisciplinarity, and it seemed to give license to do almost anything. I actually took a sociology of science course, which I could count to my history of science major, something that might surprise you who think that Princeton's history of science was always about the history of ideas only, which it was not when I was there as an undergraduate. It was not the kind of sociology of science that has happened since, I will say. But that's another story. I think that what history of science offered, so I was also there, I was taking a course in history of mentalities when I was a senior, mentalité history, with Bob Darnton and Natalie Davis, so an amazing senior seminar. And I was really interested in the relations between history of science and worldviews. But I was also very disenchanted in, I think it was in my sociology of science course, we read an exchange about paradigms that just was like so boring. And you know, like here are these incredibly smart people and they're not trying to fix anything in the world. They're arguing about what's a paradigm. And so I didn't go to grad school right away. I went to work at the Ontario Science Centre for a year. And I thought maybe public education of that kind in science might be a good direction for me. And at the same time, I applied to grad schools, and I ended up at Penn, partly because when I visited Penn, I wasn't going to tell this story, but I think it's relevant. Heilbrunn was the speaker at the workshop that week, and Rob Kohler, who was directing admissions, had invited me to come along for the dinner. And through chance, I was seated next to Heilbrunn. And he asked me about my work, and I told him I was an applicant. And he turned his back on me for the rest of the dinner. And so when he called 2 weeks later to offer me a scholarship to Berkeley, I said, I've already accepted at Penn. So one of the things that I learned from the get-go was, be nice to people, it matters. Just be polite. Just because I was a nobody didn't mean that I wasn't worthy of attention, you know? And I think that the kind of learning that I got at Penn was a lot about that it didn't matter what you were. I still thought I was going to go into museum work when I started. Mark Adams, my advisor, persuaded me not to. He said, you can do some museum work on the side. If you can do history of, you know, try it. See if you can do it in the academic world. And I got lucky there. And so that worked. So my questions have always been, I think, around how does scientific knowledge continue to claim its power as the power of truth? And what are the mechanisms that maintain that power? And what are the mechanisms that undermine it? And I think that's a question that we can use as a reset no matter which way we reset.
Great. I don't want to repeat that phrase, though I would like to. That's very much what keeps me interested in the history of science. And I think I got here through a similar trajectory to Lynn's, although from a slightly different disciplinary starting point. I started in anthropology, wanted to do cultural anthropology. Imagined myself at some point doing field work, for example, in the Amazon. That's something I saw myself eventually doing, because here's a way of life, here's a set of assumptions about the world, ways of accessing that world, and actually a physical environment that's very different than what I knew. And what would it be like to move from the worldview that I grew up in into that worldview? And while I was studying anthropology as an undergrad, I started to see anthropologists who were studying scientists and saying, wow, there's a pretty interesting set of worldviews there as well, interesting practices, interesting environments, interesting transitions and initiations into how they see the world. And likewise, historians of science, Leviathan and the Air Pump, for example, who were borrowing from anthropology. So there's a real cross-fertilization between the fields. And ultimately, for me, the question was, what are worldviews How are they different one to another? How do they get formed? How do they stay in place? How do they change? How does one break into another? I hadn't yet been exposed to the term paradigm, but that definitely fit right into that package of thoughts. Why I went from anthropology to history of science firmly is because it became clear that what I was really interested in anthropology was understanding other ways of life as a way of understanding where I came from and the world that I lived in. And if I wanted to understand Western society and also the ways in which aspects of Western society have transformed the globe, there's no way to avoid science. There's no way to avoid science and technology. That history and that reality, that everyday practice of science and technology is central to how that world is made, what we take for granted, what the real is like, how the real can change from one moment to the next. So history of science for me is the anthropology of the West, the historical anthropology of the West, and I've kept those disciplines in conversation all along. I encountered the sense, starting in history of science, that these were still the days where most of the professors had been physicists who then transferred into history. So there was a sense you kind of had to cut your teeth on the tough examples. If you were going to relativize or give a kind of social understanding of a science, you had to work with some of those hard sciences, those tougher sciences. So I kind of did my time in physics, did a bit on the mathematics, certainly mixed up with biology. And now I'm very happy that I can return to some of those softer sciences and tell the history of the human sciences, which, as it turns out, as many of you here know, are not any easier to make sense of, are not any less complicated, not any less fraught. And so that's sort of where I started and where I've got to.
Thank you, Jeremy.
If I had to summarize my trajectory as a historian of science, I would say that I started out as an interdisciplinary aspiring scholar who did not want to choose a discipline, and therefore I ended up in the history of science. But the way my career has developed over the years, including during graduate school, is an increasing commitment to a discipline, which is the discipline of history. I'm located in a history department at the University of Arizona. I'm very happy being in a regular history department. I kind of feel like history of science allows you to never really lose the interdisciplinary aspect of one's studies, whether in the subject matter that you study, because you're studying any academic discipline, science, any kind of science, even other disciplines outside of science, and also the theoretical frameworks that you can bring in from other disciplines have always been really important to my work. But the way that I developed as a scholar was to become, paradoxically, despite my initial indecisive interdisciplinarity, to become a very committed historian. And maybe that makes me somewhat different than a lot of other alumni of this program. I know there are some of us who work in regular history departments, but for me, it's become a very strong commitment. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska, I was fascinated by every discipline out there. I wanted to study everything, and history of science was something I hit upon. I was actually debating between history of science or economic and political philosophy for graduate school, both of them departments that would allow you to be interdisciplinary and get away with it. And I settled on history of science. I'm kind of glad I did. I think that I became committed to the concreteness of historical practice during the 2 years that I spent in England, actually, between my undergraduate years and my time at Penn, when I actually got to read a lot of literature in the field, and I completely changed what I wanted to do and be as a historian of science during those 2 years. And part of that, really, quite frankly, was reading the works of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, and I realized these are the kinds of faculty I want to work with. I had previously wanted to study the history of ideas, disembodied ideas, kind of the antithesis of the Penn philosophy of founding. I had wanted to study the conceptual connections between every scientific discipline and how they overlap, and I read the works of the faculty of this department, Susan's book, Ricky's book, Savage Within, and then Rob Kohler's book, Lords of the Fly, I think really kind of cemented it for me. When I read that book, I saw an important way of approaching science that I wanted to do that was more social, that was more about practices, about how science works. So I came to Penn. I wanted to be a historian. I took history courses, every semester that I was in coursework because I, by that time, had decided that I was committed to historical disciplinary practice. And I've been very happy as a historian. I teach courses in the American Revolution and the Civil War and the Gilded Age and history of American capitalism. I keep doing research work in the history of science. And I've been fascinated by the ways, I'll close with this thought, as I've worked with senior capstone students, I teach our senior capstone very regularly. And as I work with those students, with our graduate students, I'm really struck by how often, even though they're not historians of science, the history of knowledge and its production and circulation really enters into so many historical subjects in the history of food and nutrition, the history of capitalism and economics, the history of, I even did a capstone once on the 1970s, and you'd be surprised just how many people encountered the history of knowledge in one way or another, whether about the military and the Vietnam War or cultural shifts and the media, all kinds of different topics that students study. The history of knowledge and thinking about it the way that we do at Penn really has been an asset to advising those students. So that's my trajectory, kind of in a nutshell, and I'll pass it along.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy. So I didn't even know what the history of science was until I finished undergrad, where I studied communication and was fortunate enough to take a class early on with Bruce Lewinstein. And I remember vividly being in the classroom and him, it was like an introduction to communication. And he drew on the board Shannon and Weaver's model of communication. And I was like, why are in cybernetics? And, this was like the late 90s. I was like, why are we talking about this? And then he said, and this is my model, which had, Shannon and Weaver's model, this sort of very clean line, simple, elegant. And Bruce's model was like squiggles and lines. And it's all very messy and complex. And I'm like, oh, yeah, tell me more. So, I thought I was going to be a journalist, and I was interested in science as a kind of site of contested authority. I was interested in a very intimate way in my own family, the way that science, technology, and medicine were both revered and feared with a kind of equal weight, and the paradoxes that created for me just trying to grow up and make sense of what was happening around me. And so I stayed in communication because I found that it was one way to start asking questions about framing, so theories that I would encounter later in history of science and medicine, but trying to understand how experts situated themselves and how do people with technical expertise try to connect with people with decision-making authority. And so I investigated that in various ways, always imagining that I was going to be a practitioner and not an academic. And indeed, when I finished and did a master's at Cornell, where Bruce said, you're going to take some classes in this STS program. I took Intro to STS with Trevor Pinch and Tarleton Gillespie, who was there at the time. And it kind of, blew my mind apart, and it was not pretty. It was not elegant. I was like, what's happening here? But when I went and actually worked doing risk communication, I wound up at a job where I was working with not-for-profit public health clients at a for-profit media relations firm. So we were writing the op-eds for the new Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or we were kind of doing media relations for the CDC Centers for STDs, HIV, and TB at a time when people imagined that TB was something of the past, and at a time when you couldn't actually talk about sex. So it really got me thinking, this is interesting. And I was the only person working in that firm who had some training in communication and thinking about science communication. And that led me to think, I should have my own communication consulting business. And for some reason, I thought getting a PhD was going to be the way to do that. And I continued to think that, to the point where when I came time to finish my degree, I was looking both at academic jobs and actually wound up considering a job in interaction design and human factors, thinking okay, maybe I can take this knowledge and test it. And much to my surprise, and I think definitely my supervisor's surprises, I was able to land a job and wound up going to Yale, where I have an appointment in the medical school. And that kind of appealed to me, even though I had this STS inflection. And we can talk about this sort of what is the place of STS in history and sociology of science? What's that relationship? but was hired to do this strange job of kind of being an embedded historian in a medical school. And so that's been very interesting and challenging and strangely gratifying, but also teaching undergrads in Yale College and graduate students. For me, history of science is a way of asking, how do we know what we know? Why do we want to know it? And who is we anyway? And those questions continue to interest me. And increasingly, I find myself going back to my roots in communication and my interests in mass communication and mass sentiment, trying to understand different actors who maybe wouldn't be seen as considered mainstream in the history of science, or maybe mainstream in other domains. And so reckoning with this category that Susan Lindy, taught me about my first grad seminar, the popular, and trying to find ways to make sense of the kinds of ways that John, I think, put really eloquently, that reality, what is real, can shift with such fluidity, and how can we trace that and hold on to that, and where should we look? One of the interesting things about the history of science, medicine, technology, growing out of fields that were being taught by people who, many of whom were practitioners, often the stories we get conceal other whole domains of experience and questions of reliable knowledge and technical knowledge that I'd like to see more of, and I think might help many of us reckon with what we want to do in the reset and where we should look for touch points on expertise. And I guess the last thing I just want to say is what kept me going was my cohort in grad school, Jessica Martucci, Christopher Whitney, and for a brief but influential time, Ajaman Boateng. And I'll just end by saying that I remember we all had this moment somewhere in the middle of our first year where we kind of confessed to each other, like, do we even like science? And the fact that that was a question, I just put it out there because listening to Arnold's comments, it made me think about, there are lots of things that draw people to take science, technology, medicine as their subjects and objects of study. And increasingly, and this will lead to where we're going, I think this sort of sense of fear or anxiety around science, medicine, technology is one that we have a certain kind of responsibility to hold space for and take seriously.
I came to Philadelphia to Penn in 1996 as an undergraduate student, and my first degree was in anthropology. And by 2001, I was an unhappy PhD student in the Department of History here. And I was very fortunate. I was intellectually unhappy. I felt really cabined epistemologically and didn't know, I was a baby. I was a child. I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know why I was unhappy. But I had an amazing advisor, ethnohistorian Nancy Ferris, who said, you know what? You need to just stop taking classes in our department, and I'm going to send you over to this little department that you've never heard of called History and Sociology of Science. I know you're not interested in science, but they have a really interesting conceptual framework, and I think you'll like the people. And so I enrolled in Science and Colonialism with Ricky Kuklik in the 2000 and 2001 cohorts, I think, in HSS, and then basically moved into the lounge in what was then Logan Hall. So I'm one among many sort of defectors from other departments initially, but I still dropped out. And I had a 10-year intermission where, and everyone's gonna love, I was a university administrator. I worked in life sciences licensing and was the associate director for intellectual property at Penn. And then I became an intellectual property attorney. And I thought, maybe I've been interested in science and technology all along. And by the time I thought maybe I had more to learn and something to say, to borrow a line from the Talking Heads, I knew that this must be the place. What I've always been interested in is basically a big question, which is just how do people work to build the worlds that they believe they would like to live in? And I think that coming at that question through knowledges, techniques, and technologies offers a really powerful way of answering those how questions. And so I find I'm now not in a history of science department, but I find that is a very mobile and salient framework that still is with me today, and I think helps a lot of people, a lot of students that I've encountered who aren't historians of science.
Thank you so much to all of you. So our next set of questions continues from this one, and then we'll do the audience interlude and invite invite more participation. So these are just a set of questions to ask you to reflect on Penn's History and Sociology of Science Department's place in the field of history of science, technology, medicine more broadly. So how has Penn HSS shaped the way that you do your research and or teaching? How have you adapted the lessons that you've learned from Penn HSS to your work in other institutions? And how would you characterize Penn HSS's impact on our field and perhaps the world more broadly?
I just want to say that I'm extremely honored to be among these distinguished Penn alumni, HSS alumni, of which I'm not one. But I think by being invited to be on this panel, I'm being called an alumnus, yeah, and that to me is just a real, very flattering claim. In fact, it's actually true though, because I've learned more in Penn HSS than I've learned anywhere else. So I really do feel like I've taken the program. I've taken I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I've drunk the Kool-Aid. It's really shaped the way that I think and the way that I work, the way that I teach. The tripod. So there is something peculiar, as Jesse just mentioned, in the fact that we are presented here in 3 panels on 3 different topics, when the essential experience is that those things get mixed together. And that's true in the introductory grad course, and it's true in the hallways, and it's true all the time. You're hearing from all these different fields and thinking about how they fit together and how you need to draw on each of them to make sense of any individual topic. I've learned so much from colleagues. I've learned so much from students. I mean, just to keep up with them, what they wrote, and then going quickly to read whatever author they were citing. That's been a huge learning experience. Where this applies in teaching and research is just everywhere. You know, I can't think of studying science without thinking about technology, without thinking about environment. Medicine, sometimes I can leave to the side, but it does come in quite a bit. I got here when pretty much everyone, David Barnes excluded, was teaching 20th century, more or less, and Nathan Sibin also excluded in his own way. And someone who said, "Oh, you're going to Penn. Because you work on the 19th century, you're basically going to be the classicist there," which wasn't really true. I mean, it was great to get a lot of training or a lot of exposure to 20th century topics. I mean, actually amazing. That was new to me. But also in teaching the survey, we went way back to origins, the history, the survey history of science. Now, rather than being in a department where most people work on the 20th century, at the Warburg Institute, most of my colleagues are deep in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. So I'm the modernist. I'm the one who's working on these crazy new topics in the 19th century that they're having a hard time getting their heads around. But what the Penn training brings to those settings is really a great deal, because, for instance, looking at the 16th century genre of cosmographies, thinking about those as simply intellectual texts or scientific texts, that you can go somewhere with that, but thinking about the technology of how the object was made, the technology involved in sailing the boats to the places that made sense, that show up in those pages. It's a history of technology, it's a history of landscape, it's a history of environments, it's a history of medicine. Galen's there in thinking about these environments as well. So it's all a package, and sometimes my colleagues say, well, why are you mixing all this together? We have the intellectual historians on one side, historians of technology on another, and to me they just obviously go together. And one on the last point about where does Penn sit among other departments, I think others will have more to say, but Susan mentioned, well, quite rightly, that HSS has taken the global turn, and we're very interested in the history of knowledge in multiple traditions. And I agree, but I would say that when I got here, Penn had already taken that turn. I mean, they were ahead of the turn, and it was just obvious with Steve Fireman, with Ricky Kuklik's interest in the history of anthropology, with Nathan, that science wasn't the property of one time or place. It was something that had many different forms in many different places, and it's, to me, just a delight to see that turn continues, that with what Sebastián's doing, Projit, Haroon, with Rema, that continues, and I'm sure there'll be other movements in that direction. And that was truly trend-setting, like in all the ways that I think Arnold Thackeray suggested, the mixing, the lowering of the tone, the bringing of ideas back to bodies and to social forms, that was ahead of the curve, but HSS was always already global.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on something that John just said, which resonates well with me, having to do with the three-part structure of science, technology, and medicine, that's structuring our panels, and that to some extent when I was in the department, we would identify ourselves that way, with some people falling in between. And when I started out, I was definitely interested in the history of science. I was also interested in the history of technology and environmental history, and in bringing them into the history of science. I wanted nothing to do with the history of medicine, sort of like you. But I actually found, on the contrary, that I got sucked into being interested in the history of medicine during the workshops, during conversations with grad school colleagues who were working in the history of medicine. And I realized that it was a lot more interesting than I had thought. And so when I started my first teaching post at Dickinson College, when I designed a course on the history of American science and technology, I thought, why don't I put medicine in there too, even though it's not what I studied? I'd heard so many workshops and had so many excellent conversations, and it was a really good decision to bring the history of health and medicine in. And I've done that in my teaching, even as I moved to University of Arizona. I've done that ever since. So I think that this encouragement of breaking down the walls between these subjects, but also to put technology and medicine as prominent subjects of a department of the history of science, I think has been really integral to the identity of the Penn HSS brand, so to speak. But thinking more broadly, I think this question is a little difficult to answer about the influence of Penn HSS for a reason that several of you have already hinted at or said, which is that the whole field of history of science has kind of moved in a similar direction to what Penn HSS has done. So it's kind of difficult to separate out what is Penn HSS, what is just the general movement into social and cultural history of science, and looking at science in its wider context, in connection with technology, in connection with health and medicine. But as I thought about what really is sort of the signature pedagogy or move of the history of science at Penn, I think really at the heart of it is trying to understand how science works. I'm thinking more on the history of science side here, even though it applies somewhat to technology and medicine. But I think trying to understand how science has worked, thinking of science more broadly in terms of different knowledge systems and different alternatives that were not realized, a sense of the contingency of the kinds of methodologies that were developed in different scientific disciplines, a different way that it could have turned out, but a struggle to understand science not just on the terms of the internal debates of the scientific field itself, of trying to get sucked into their own debates over which theory is correct and trying to explain why, but to understand the subtle mechanisms that underlie science and how it works that maybe the people engaged in it don't even think about or realize because they're so naturalized to the people participating in it that they don't even really acknowledge or even think about that it could have been otherwise. And so I think this sense of standing outside of it, sympathetic to it, but also at a critical distance to be able to think about the ways that it's function, that the ways that science works and doesn't work, and how they reflect contingent historical circumstances. I guess that's part of what drove me to become a disciplinary historian, is my love of historical contingencies. But I think there's a lot of other things one could say about the Penn approach and what it's meant. I was thinking as I was how to frame this, the book I read recently that I really enjoyed a lot and thought was a really powerful book by Elizabeth Pott Berman called Thinking Like an Economist. I don't know if any of you read that one. It's a really great book. And I thought, well, what would be the alternative? Thinking like a Penn HSS. And I kind of came to the conclusion that thinking like a Penn HSS is almost the polar opposite of thinking like an economist. Because whereas in the thinking like with apologies to any economists in the room, thinking like an economist means developing a model of the world in which the efficiency, the model of efficiency is presumed to be the best or correct way to look at situations, and that other systems and values are getting in the way of that. I think of Penn HSS as trying to uncover the different systems of values that people bring to the table, whether as dissidents within a scientific community or whether outsiders, whether it's people who work with scientists or who protest against what they're doing, that there are a whole variety of different value systems that people bring to the table. And one of the ways that we do escape the kind of confines of the debate within science itself to see things that are happening within it is to adopt that perspective of differing value systems all being historically reconstructible and thinking about how things could have been otherwise through the lens of those different competing systems of values based on equity or based on other criteria besides efficiency, for example. So I think that we as historians of science in the Penn tradition have really tried to bring that sensibility to all sorts of different subjects, from the natural sciences to the human sciences, now even to other subjects, anywhere where knowledge is being produced. And as I said before, I think it's almost everywhere. So I do hope that going forward, as I think about how to adapt, this is one of the questions we were asked, how to adapt to these as I become a person advising people in a regular history department, is the ways that these questions are embedded in almost every historical question that is asked. And I think we can bring that sensibility. I don't know, others may not agree if we should just try to melt into history or not. I get a feeling maybe not, but I find it very productive to bring that to the table among my fellow historians.
Okay, so I guess, I'll just quickly reiterate the tripartite emphasis that all of us had to take classes in medicine, science, and technology, irrespective of what we thought we were interested in. And I think that's led to dissertations and programs and projects that are really distinctive and have a particular kind of shape that marks them as perhaps unique to Penn. I know it really had that impact for me. But I also think in terms of what the knowledge that we have and what I taught, everything I learned about how to be an academic and how to navigate the institution that I now exist in, and the institution I came out of that trained me, came from what I learned in my history of science books. So, I read, the PhD machine and was like, okay, how does this apply to me? Or, I was having a conversation with a grad student reading Latour. You can say what you want about him, but it turns out that many people, there was a reason why his work is getting taken seriously in so many different corners of the university and beyond, because he provides a pretty, almost maybe a little bit too economist-ish model of how institutions work, how power works. And there's something really interesting if you think about the knowledge that we have gained through our studies as actually enabling us in a very material and sometimes crude way to navigate institutions. That maybe isn't... It's a banal comment, but I also have found it to be very profound in that, it leads to some bigger ethical questions. I often think sometimes that when I encounter issues working with grad students or looking at crises within the university, or even seeing the fossil fuel, divestment protests happening across campus, and I think how that would be received if someone gave it as a paper and the history of the present at HSS versus someone working to kind of be an activist in those areas. What I guess maybe I'm trying to say is that I'm interested to see a history of science that is able to reckon with its own embeddedness within the very institutions that it writes about and critiques and acknowledges. And in some ways, I think there's a little bit of a misstep or a mismatch there in the kinds of work that we celebrate versus some of the ways that we organize ourselves. And I don't know that there's any way to avoid it, but I do think it's something I'm really interested in paying attention to and trying to track and take seriously. And I think it matters a lot for the future of our field, like who wants to be a part of it, who feels hailed by the questions that we ask, who can see themselves and feel safe within these kinds of conversations. So just to say, I think there's actually like a lot in the history of science, medicine, technology, and in the Penn program. And maybe Arnold's point was actually, Arnold's talk underscored this for me, that we're moving through institutions that our own values may or may not align with, and understanding what makes those institutions tick, we have a unique purchase on that. And so to kind of see ourselves as part of, maybe as Steve Shapin would say, like never pure, things are never pure, and neither are we. So I think the training I got at Penn gave me the ability to locate myself as someone doing this. And maybe this is all part of an ethnographic or anthropological impulse. So yeah, I'll stop there, but I'd be interested to open that up for discussion later.
so I think some of what I'm going to say kind of resonates with what's already been said. But so I came here as a lawyer, and the process of becoming a lawyer, they break you down and rebuild you in a particular habitus. And so I kind of needed to be reprogrammed. And I'm very grateful to everyone in the department, obviously, especially Susan, but also Jason Oakes for informing me not to wear a business suit to my admissions interview. So one of the most valuable things in that reprogramming was sort of just ways of thinking critically and analytically about disciplinarity as a mode of knowledge curation. And I'm especially grateful to John in that respect for pushing me to read very, very broadly, much more broadly and deeply than I thought I needed to, or I thought I wanted to, but that has kind of transformed the way just who I am as a scholar and how I teach others. And I think that's a part of a broader ethos in the department of learning where the lines are drawn so that you can intentionally transgress them. I think Ruth Cowan explained this in our first year, in my cohort's first year, as we need to discipline you so that you can be undisciplined. And I think that's what HSS for me has kind of brought to the table.
Since everybody has spoken about the breadth of history of science, technology, and medicine here and bringing them together, I don't need to go into that in much detail. I will say that I teach the intro for the last 5 years, and I did this also 20 years ago for 2 years. I've taught the intro grad course that required by our HSMT grad students. And I have fundamentally been equipped to do that by my own training in this department. And that bringing that together again has just been enormously fruitful and productive in, the history of technology was total news to me. And doing a seminar paper that involved doing research in patents, it was like, whoa, what is this as a source? These are amazing. Or looking at actual objects. This was really different from the kind of history I'd been exposed to before. But I do think that in my generation of the first half of the 80s at Penn, something really special happened, and partly engineered by Arnold, I think, but not predictable in some ways, which was my cohort was there at a moment when the faculty on the program realized they had something in common, which they called the Penn program, and which Rob called the middle ground, focusing not on the history of ideas, not on the big kind of history that a lot of general historians focused on, but on disciplines, on institutions, on communities. And so at that time, Arnold was working on Gentlemen of Science. Rob had just published his book on biochemistry. Russ Mollitz was working on history of pathological anatomy. So there really was, and Hughes was working on networks of power. And so there was this idea of looking at systems, whether they're small, whether they're large, and I still teach that, right? And so it's like when we look at socio-technical systems, what are we looking at? And what happens when you scale it up and you scale it down? And it's just an incredibly productive way of thinking analytically about pretty much anything, really. And it's not a surprise that the course that we teach has for a long time been a course that people in the ed school, people in communications arts, people in other departments across our university know as a course to send graduate students to. This happened before I started teaching it too, as a place to get really well educated in this kind of thinking. The other thing that I wanted to say, we were asked to say something about the impact on our field and the world more broadly. Well, here we are, and we're everywhere when we're not here, right? But we're also not just in academia. And I think that one of the sets of tools that we have gotten is a kind of systemic analysis that make us as a group excellent analysts, project managers, editors, administrators. Okay, I'm going to do this now. How many of you has had a administrative position in a university, chair or above? Just raise your hand. See? That's a pretty good percentage. So just note that, because there's so few people who can actually understand how universities work, how disciplines work, how to do the work across the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, and engineering and medicine. Editors, museum curators, out in the world, there's also ways that this group has made a difference, and that is maybe a little less visible by panelists like us up here. And I hope we're going to get a chance to hear more about that at the dinner tonight. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a few minutes now for audience questions or comments.
Hi, thanks, Bruce Lunstein. Thank these are all great. I want to pick up actually on Lynn's last point, which is the intentionality of the mixing of the fields. I remember shortly before I came in '83, there had been some kind of workshop where some of the faculty, I think it was Rosemary, Mark, and Tom, had done a convergent themes workshop. And I think there might have been other similar kind of things, so that there was an explicit identification. It wasn't just that it happened. It was, they worked at it. And I don't know whether other people had that experience as well.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Stevens. Thank you for saying that, because we tried. And one of the great things about being on the faculty was one could read each other's work, and it was the most interesting, exciting stuff to read, and we did. So there was an integration of knowledge across the board, because we were interested in each other's work. We were friends. We had students. This was in the 80s, I guess. And it was it was a good atmosphere for, I hope, for students as well.
Hi. This was wonderful to hear. And I guess I kind of want to connect this panel with the panel from yesterday and ask the participants to comment on where they think the field is going. What do they think will happen in like the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Thanks. Hi, this is Deborah Fitzgerald. I want to say something kind of like that, which is because I flip between the history of technology and the history of science, I've sort of lost track of the extent to which the Penn program is still recognizably, distinctively in evidence at conferences, for example. Like, have the methods of the Penn program been adopted by pretty much all the other programs, or are we still out there creating something new?
So when I started at Penn the third time, I don't recall one of the students in cohorts had said, the thing about Penn is I can't tell you what we do here exactly that creates this, but you can go to a talk at HSS or SHOT or AHM, and you don't know the person, don't know where they're from, you can tell if they were trained at Penn. And I have found that often to be the case, that there's a particular, I want to almost call it a style of work and a style of method that it's like, you know it when you see it.
I could just say it sort of relates to the science studies versus history of science, because when I took 505, which was the intro class, I took it with Ruth Schwartz-Cowan, and in many ways it was a kind of history of science studies in a particular sort of way, and I think that in part, like when I went to Yale, that was a department that really didn't have that flavor. And so and I was nervous about going there. I'm like, do they know what they did? And they gave me the opportunity to teach a required class that was like problems in science studies, even though we also had a problems in history of science. And in a way, I think listening to everybody and reflecting on what that class has meant has kind of been my effort to sort of train people in a Penn program way, with the less of an emphasis on what might have been considered canonical in, STS. Like I did teach the strong program a couple times, but moved away. But really trying to think about a way of asking questions that is definitely been informed by my experience at Penn. And it is interesting to see that reflected in students. And it's less about the like medicine side tech trifecta, but a willingness to bridge different fields. So I think about Beans Veloci, who's now on the faculty here, that thought, well, what would it mean to bring, science studies or history of science into conversation with history of sexuality? And that really produces tremendous kinds of potential for new sorts of questions. So I think, it's less about content, but maybe more about, process. Less about product and more about process, and that kind of process of being able to see disciplines as able to be remixed, admixed, reimagined that I look for and I identify and try to bring out in my teaching, and what makes it kind of special to reconnect with people that have that same orientation.
And if I can just abuse my chair position for 1 second, I would just, to the last question, say that, like, having just finished the PhD, I've been at SHOT and HSS and 4S and the AAAs, and I don't go to AHM because I'm like these guys, but I hear about it from others. And, we're out there. Like, the Penn PhDs are doing the coolest panels.
I'm really grateful for the questions you asked and the answers that were given, because it gave me an insight into my own career, which I've never had before. And that is that people my age grew up into the history of science at a time when scientists, actually physicists, thought they knew everything about the world, and that who proceeded to humiliate everybody else. Some of you may know I'm in the middle of finishing, that sounds odd, a history of the National Academy of Sciences. And I can tell you that the National Academy of Sciences refused to consider engineers as members and humiliated clinical physicians, research clinicians, which is why there was a separate Academy of Sciences, a separate National Academy of Engineering, and a separate Institute of Medicine. They wouldn't even let the research clinicians call themselves an academy. Okay, 2016, they merged. Same thing has happened in our fields. When I was studying the history of science at Berkeley with John Hobron, we were both graduate students at the same time, we were not allowed, we were told that the history of technology was totally stupid. And the only people, we were better than they were because we were talking about ideas. Okay? When I shifted in my career to become an historian of technology, I was told that I could no longer teach the history of science. When I was a graduate student and wanted to leave the University of California, I ended up at Johns Hopkins, but I wasn't allowed to study in the history of medicine. Literally, it was a separate building, separate part of Baltimore, because I wasn't a physician. So the tensions that disappeared in the Penn department had their roots in the tensions in those disciplines, that is, science, engineering, and medicine. And the wonderful thing about the Penn department was it didn't pay any attention to that.
Thank you. At this point, I'm going to ask folks to save their questions for the end of the panel. So we're not done. We still have a second part. So there will be more opportunities for folks to weigh in. But Haroon was already kind of anticipating a bit of what we're going to do with the second part of the session, which is, kind of thinking about where the field is going. And we're a little bit behind time. So what I think I'm going to do is just collapse the last two themes, which I think work, in tandem anyways. And, just to kind of set this up, I think, one of the things that I'm hearing in this panel and that I've heard sort of, across many of the talks so far at this event is that, we're really good at showing how power works. We are really good at showing how power works at multiple scales, at the very sort of local level, at the level of institutions, at the level of infrastructures, universities, at the cosmological level. So, I think we're right to celebrate that, we are really good at kind of showing how power works, how our values might be misaligned with our institutions, and that makes for folks who are good administrators as well. But thinking about sort of our immediate past, we've been living through some really complex and challenging times that seem fraught with both danger and possibility. We've, at least in the time that I've been here at Penn, I've witnessed, sort of the emergence of a sort of a global authoritarian right-wing movement, uprisings and protests around systemic racism, pandemics, the intensification of climate change, rising global economic inequality. And I think all of you are pointing out that we have some really good tools for teaching our students and thinking about what's going on. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, though, is that, it seems as though there's a real kind of call to action. And this is what I would like us to also think about. What do you think historians of science can and should do to address the challenges of our present and future? And what are some of the tools that we have at our disposal for addressing these challenges? And maybe this is where we can also begin to come back to this theme of the Great Reset. The other kind of thing that I wanted to throw in the mix for our panelists to respond to, and many of you have already alluded to the connections between our field and anthropology, and it's interesting. I've found it really interesting to kind of observe the response of anthropologists to some of our recent crises, and in some cases, and so I'm thinking of the anthropologist Ryan Cecil Jobson, who has suggested that the existential threats of climate change and authoritarianism pose fundamental challenges that raise the question of whether the discipline should be left to burn or presumably built anew. So, at least in anthropology, which is a field that we've many of us sort of read widely, and one of the responses has been to say that, perhaps we should just sort of begin anew entirely. So given that we've borrowed so much from this field, what can we take from this conversation? Has our field been immune to this sense of disciplinary crisis? And do we need to engage in more self-examination as anthropology has done? I also want to invite our speakers to highlight any initiatives or projects in this vein that they might want to highlight, or any things that they want to bring to our attention.
If we're going with the Family Feud style here, which I think we are, that means I get to start this one. So I think the last couple of years have been really difficult for everybody. And I think it's really brought home in ways that we didn't realize fully were true, just how difficult some of the challenges humanity is facing are right now. And I think the response to the pandemic in particular has made those of us who are into environmental issues a lot, which is probably most of us at this point, really concerned about what that tells us about our capacity to address climate change and other environmental crises. Because if people are unwilling and unable to, or if I should say systems and structures, political leadership are unwilling to move in directions that need to be moved in order to deal with a pandemic crisis, which is killing people all around us, what's the chances? I guess you could say maybe the climate crisis is now killing people all around us as well. So given the apocalyptic kind of dire way I started out this comment, you may be surprised to find that I am going to move in a little bit different direction, which is I think if there's anything that our studies of the history of knowledge have taught us, and the systems of knowledge that are institutionalized, that are in systems that are all around us. It's that people who think they can fix problems are often not the people who fix problems. There are oftentimes people who make problems worse or create other problems. And so I think in some ways, what I would call for as a field is for humility as a starting point, and a humility about what we as a field can even do about any of these problems. And that for us to think about what I would like to think of is the ways that we can help address them in the unexpected ways. And so what I would call for is a history of science that is searching out the unexpected ways we can contribute to addressing these larger problems. And that is through identifying lines of influence and lines of knowledge production, really, that can be critiqued historically, even though they're not the main debate that's playing out in the larger public sphere. And so I'll give just a couple quick examples of that. I could talk about the global economic inequality is something that, as a kind of historian of capitalism, I'm deeply concerned about. I think it's at the root of a lot of these problems. Our inability to deal with these problems is because of global economic inequality. But we as historians of science know that global economic inequality is also epistemic inequality in many cases, and that one of the tools we bring as historians of science is to point out places where alternative ways of thinking and alternative ways of approaching problems, whether from different epistemic traditions or dissident traditions within scientific disciplines, where those can perhaps gain a greater leverage, perhaps, over problems that have remained intractable within the systems that currently exist. I kind of feel like the history of science methodology, and I know this may not be true equally for everybody. I'm more of a political economy sort of person, maybe than average, but having become a part of a history department, it's really, I wasn't aware till I became in a professor in a regular history department, just how much cultural history had for many years kept political economy kind of at the margins of the discipline of history. And I've never felt like that at Penn. I felt like political economy and cultural approaches to history were always deeply integrated in the training that I received at Penn and in the work of all the scholars on the faculty and graduate students. And so I think to some extent that allowed me to feel that political and economic issues were important to the practice of the kind of cultural history that we were doing. So I was getting a little off track there, sorry. But it's important that we think about kind of oblique ways of approaching these problems, like global economic inequality, like climate change, like pandemics. So thinking about climate change, we could all just try to write histories of why don't people agree with climate science, and what is the reason why climate science, and there's room for that kind of work, and it's important to show the ways that, say, fossil fuel companies have systematically tried to obscure or muddy the waters about climate. That's all important work. But I also wonder, on top of that, using the tools of the history and sociology of science, if we might also look at the dominant models for projecting climate change and its effects and how they have been systematically skewed by the assumptions of the fields that have approached them, especially economics. And I think that those kinds of questions that we can ask about what are the reasons behind different projections and what do they obscure and what choices were made when those models were set up might put us in a relationship to the climate debate that is not just falling into the, do you think climate is a problem or don't you think? Do you want to take action or don't you? But to think historically about what lines of action have been proposed, which ones have not, what are the frameworks for understanding the very nature of the problem in terms of time discounting for the future and how much investment is worthwhile. And I think there's a lot of questions that we can ask as historians of science that will get at these issues in different ways than other people, because there's a ton of people out there talking about every one of these issues, from systemic racism to global economic inequality. But I think what we can do is that we can figure out why the decisions were made that were about how to model these problems, how to conceptualize these problems, and what other paths could have been taken, alternative paths that did not win out in the history of science. So that's what I would put on the table, starting with a sense of humility about what we actually can't do, and then trying to think of ways that we can obliquely approach these problems in ways that others are not doing. And I think we're well positioned to do that.
A lot of things that I want to say, but I guess something just going from the prompt of like the experience of the pandemic has really brought into relief to me just how hard it is, even as someone with relative privilege and the privilege that many of us have in this room, to just do the jobs that we have, whatever they are. And I find myself doing an enormous amount of like pastoral care for colleagues, friends, graduate students who are just dealing with the kinds of illnesses that come from overwork or come from the discrepancies between the work that you want to do and the values of your institution. And I found myself, perhaps this is because I'm in a medical school and someone who has always been interested in history of medicine, thinking about, what kinds of actual, like, what if part of the responsibility of this field or our field was to figure out, how to actually live in the now, as opposed to the sort of projections of the big problems or the big agenda setting issues. It's definitely not sexy, but it may be the one thing standing between a more, vitalized labor force for the work that we do, and may enable more kinds of people to be able to sustain interest and activity in this work. So, one hope coming out of the pandemic is that also concerns about ableism and racism and, sexism and all of these sorts of questions actually kind of matter. And maybe one of the things I think about is like in the academy, right? We all know, for those of us who are in the academy, the emphasis on publish or perish, and that we have to produce these articles. And I kind of had this strange existential moment as someone who wrote a lot about, the kind of practices and techniques and otherwises of epidemiological knowledge making, only to find that when the pandemic first hit, I was like, yeah, okay, like this isn't going to be a 2-week spring break. Like this is going to be years. This is how it's going to go. And to find myself actually feeling very alone and very alienated from the institutions that I was in, who wanted to talk to economists and epidemiologists without any sort of attention or awareness to how those things fit. And it kind of really left me to do some soul searching. So I don't have like a clear, answer, but to say like, is it the right thing for me to write some more articles in the vein or books in the vein that I was writing that I thought was really good, like rigorous scholarship, or is it to kind of think about how to support people on the ground? And one of the things that a couple of my colleagues and I did right when the pandemic started was recognizing in the medical school many med students, nursing students, PA students were unable to be on the wards getting certain kind of training that they were paying to receive, and that were a critical part to say, okay, well, what does our kind of knowledge enable us to do? And we kind of pivoted and made this pop-up elective that we called History of the Present, which, was on the one hand an effort to kind of build an archive out of experiences in the early days of the pandemic, but also to kind of recognize the forms of labor involved in, care workers surviving themselves through what we know to have been incredibly traumatic and painful circumstances. And so that's kind of inspired me to think about, what role we have to play in helping, other professionals, scientists, doctors, nurses, physician assistants, emergency medical workers, engineers, understand the conditions of their own labor and the forces that keep them from having the agency that they might have to make those changes too. Which I guess kind of relates to one of my own experiences. The ways that I felt actually the most satisfaction come from the work that I do has been in the building of individual relationships with different practitioners, be they physicians or scientists. And it's often not because they read something that I wrote and then that convinced them, but it's because we had lunch and I asked them about things they were struggling with, and, they sort of talked about it, and then that led to some kinds of collaborations or things like that. So maybe I'm kind of like, I don't know, an emergent sort of call for more intimacy and attention to practices of care in the way that we do the work we do, which again isn't probably going to get any big grants or anything like that. But it does feel like, wouldn't it be interesting to try to write to use the insights that we have to direct to the not like distant future, but to the right now, and the ways in which we're trying to figure out how to reassemble the social in a very, very material, critical way.
So I have been following the case for letting anthropology burn, and one of my senior colleagues has been really involved in that. And I think that conversation is really important, but simultaneously I'm also, from my own selfish perspective, I'm interested in sort of practices, like what I can do now with whatever power I have quietly on a day-to-day basis to create a different situation than we're living in. And so I want to answer this kind of provocation or question in two ways. And first, to talk about that set of issues within academia, and then second, the connections between academia and its outsides, or collaborations between academia and communities and issues that have not been within it. So as within academia, so I'm the junior person. I'm not the youngest on the panel, but I am the junior most person on the panel. One thing, so when I think about the problems that Gabrielle really saliently outlined yesterday about inclusion, about elitism, about epistemic racism, and all of these issues that are well known within our fields and well known within the academy generally, I think about how much work it's going to take to change that, and the work that anyone can do. I think being junior, it's easy to be attuned to the power that you don't have. When you're contingent, when you're a grad student, when you're postdoc, before tenure, whatever it is, when you're outside of the academy, it can be easy to see constraint rather than affordance. But I'm struck by the many, many decisions that go into like the work I do every single day. What will I teach? Who am I teaching? What, all the committee work, all of the tiny little decisions, there are all these decision points in a day. And I think the people who I have seen who are really bringing change to fruition think about every single little decision through the lens of the world that as they want it rather than as it is. And so I think that kind of intent, and I've seen my colleague Kamari Clark, who is involved in this case for letting anthropology burn, I've watched her do that, and I think that's been helpful to me in thinking about how we change the academy. With reference to connections outside of the academy, the broader context questions, I think there's a couple of things that I want to say. So I work on nuclear colonialism and legal mobilization, and I think within the circles that I run in, a lot of people, many scholars, are actually deeply involved with collaborations with communities, legal history, sociolegal studies. That there's not a perceived barrier because between work inside the academy and work outside of it, I think in the same way. But also in the nuclear space, many people work quietly with nuclear affected communities, doing tremendous work, and with policymakers as well, trying to change from that angle. So I see a lot of work that people are doing, and I think in some ways I very much also appreciate the quiet work, because it can't all be about branding, right? I mean, that's important, but it's also just important what people do and how people live out their commitments on a day-to-day. Shout out to two initiatives that I think are doing really important work. Is the CLEAR Laboratory at Memorial University in Newfoundland that was started by Max Lebiran. So it's a science studies laboratory, but it's an anti-racist, feminist, anti-colonial laboratory that makes knowledge about marine plastics pollution and then makes knowledge about making knowledge. And Max's recent book, Pollution is Colonialism, I think is a really, really powerful reflection on method in that space. And then at University of Toronto, Michelle Murphy's Technoscience Research Unit, especially its Environmental Data Justice Lab, again, is working in collaboration with communities to make knowledge about environmental harm and to use that to affect governance, but also to think about how that knowledge is made. And so those are two initiatives that I think about a lot and deeply admire.
Well, in case anybody hasn't heard it, because I've been telling everybody who's I've talked to here. So I'm retiring at the end of this year. So my intervention is to get out of the way. And my comments on this about tools and approaches. I mean, I actually had written down, we're schooled in looking historically for roads not taken, and lifting them up as thinking about why. So very much in the vein that Jeremy said. But I think that there's also a bigger change that I would characterize this way. My generation came into the field with a mandate to be neutral in a very strong way. And I came to realize as I was thinking about this that it was a kind of a combination of the bugaboo of Whig history, mustn't have the history leading to the present, and the symmetry principle of early SSK, right? We need to look at failure and success in the same way. And both of those emphasize a very analytical stance and a kind of a distance on contemporary issues and on the history that I find very appealing. On the other hand, it doesn't invite action. And I do think that once you say, oh, we also have an ethical job here, we also have a job to say who benefits and who suffers from the decisions that are made in the name of science, then it gets a little trickier to just maintain the analytical distance. And that's something that I struggled with for a long time. And I have a very, classic middle of the road way to do this. I'm doing history on scientists who dealt with that problem in the revolutions of 1848. Were they going to get active? Were they not going to get active? And what focused their decisions? And I hope that might be able to tell us something about the ways that those decisions seem the same now and then, and the ways in which maybe they're also very different. And when I retire, I'll also be doing more political work, I hope. So that's not, I just can't speak to new initiatives in the academy now because those are up to other people.
Thanks. I would definitely second that point that we do have to wrestle with our relation to neutrality. And I think there, a simple way of just my answer to that is it's okay for your students to get really worked up about stuff, and it's okay to encourage them to get worked up about stuff. The students who go through our classrooms are going to go out into the world and deal with things, and if they have passions and they're really concerned about the state of the world, that's great because they can make a difference. What Steve Chapin was saying about the students at Harvard mostly focusing on the present while the people teaching them are focusing on the past, that seems to me like a very good division of labor, right? Those are the students who are going to go work in government, work in business, work wherever. They're the ones who should be thinking about the present, but informed by what they're taught about how the past has been. Very much everything that people have said, I share the feeling with. The one thing that Jeremy said was the importance of humility, and yes, I totally agree. We should be approaching things with, on the ground, as Joanna was saying. How are people living these questions? How are we surviving through these challenges? And like Mary said, what are the decisions day to day, minute to minute that people are making? And let's make space for those and think about those intellectually as well as practically. But along with humility, I'd say let's make space for some grandiosity in our thinking. Two places that I think that's relevant that have already been mentioned is in thinking about institutions. Thinking we have the skills to see how ideas get entrenched, how biases get entrenched, inequalities get entrenched. We also have the skills to see how they can get unentrenched, especially thinking about the university, the changes that have happened to universities worldwide in the last 40 years, where there's a real intensification, a real growth of the administrative level, where tuitions skyrocket. That money does not go to grad students. It doesn't even really go to faculty. It's not going to the precariat. It's not going to adjuncts. Where is it going? Well, it's going to brand new buildings and administrative salaries on a huge scale, who are paying court to the kind of corporate overlords who will then fund them to do more of that. And sorry to put it in such brutal terms, it's such a beautiful building funded by wonderful donors. But I think we have the skills to see how that works. And we have to, draw the line at a certain point and say our ability to do our work, our ability to train a responsible citizenry depends on inhabiting institutions that function otherwise, that aren't simply engines of creating more of the inequality that we teach our students exists through historical examples. And truly, I'm just saying it because it kind of is an emergency. Like in the last 40 years, all of those trends have gotten more and more severe, so that the university is a citadel. It's a defining possibility of entering into the middle or upper classes, and everyone's terrified about whether they'll make it in, over that hump. So there's a lot of fear and paranoia around preserving structures that just aren't sustainable. So stepping back from that with a bit of grandiosity, saying, well, what kind of educational system, for what ends, given what we know from history, would we want to bring about, I think is a worthwhile exercise for teachers, researchers, students. The other place where grandiosity might be of use, I think, is thinking about, as Sebastián said, in thinking about cosmologies. And as Lynn mentioned, worldviews, right? We study worldviews. We study how science is a history of worldviews. We study many alternatives of worldviews, things that different cosmologies and how they've come into being, how they hold, how they change. Everything that was said on the panel so far reminds me of this very strong sense. I don't know if it's because I've got jet lag, but this really strong sense that we're entering a new kind of cosmology. We're entering a new kind of temporality. I mean, the reset of the pandemic, the reset of the really visible social struggles and conflicts makes it clear that the answers that we've been giving and that science has been giving aren't answers that work any longer. And those answers are given within the framework of an assumption of what the world is like, how we know it, and who the experts are. And the historians of science are the people who know that. I think it's absolutely our obligation to be providing histories, comparative studies of other ways of being in the world, other cosmologies, other worldviews, as resources for that kind of thinking, not just at the level of ideas, but very much in that middle ground that Lynn and Rob have talked about. How are they thought of, but then how are they lived? What kinds of practices, what kinds of rhythms, what kinds of temporalities can bring about those more sustainable, more livable, more vibrant ways of living together in the cosmos. Exactly what that cosmos will be, I think, is still somewhat up for grabs, but history of science is very well placed to contribute to that conversation.
The question I struggle with is we all I think are here because we agree that history of science is so well positioned to do that. But what I found in my own institution is that nobody else really seems to understand or think that. And so, one of the things that I just wanted to kind of call into the place is like the sort of what are the practices that we need to innovate, as historians of science to help us navigate that, because I often find there's this weird mix of like technophobia and technophilia that travel together that become very difficult for people like us to navigate or parse. And so, it's an honest, humble question, but I can't think of a better group of people to try to suss that out with.
Can I respond quickly to Joanna? I think one of the so when I finally started teaching great numbers of students, what I realized was the power that undergraduate teaching has, because you have and in many cases, I don't know about other folks, but like a lot of STEM students take my classes, and you have that moment where you can shape their views and so I just wanted to speak, I guess, to I think the power of undergraduate teaching as a vehicle for our programs and for shaping the world.
We can have some questions from the audience.
I'm Tom Carroll again. I don't usually disagree with Ruth about anything actually, but I have to say that I didn't always have kumbaya moments in the late 70s in the department about everybody agreeing, and the scientists and the engineers and the medical people all hugging each other and so on. When I came here, Arnold became my advisor sort of by default, but as an undergraduate, I studied the history of science with Dan Kevles, and I also worked for the historians at Jet Propulsion Laboratory and published my first paper on the history of solid propellant rocketry. So I did some history of science and history of technology and came here very much with the intention of doing exactly what Jeremy's doing, and which I ended up doing, which was becoming an American historian who looked at science and technology in American culture combined. But there was one very poignant moment in the late 70s of my career
when Tom Hughes cornered me one evening at a social gathering and tried to convince me to change majors and to have him become my advisor, because he said doing the history of technology was what was really important to me and what I ought to do because it was better than doing history of science. And I said, well, I love you, Tom, and I've taken all your courses, and I think you're great, and I think systems are great, and so on. And I'm going to do all that, but I don't want to be a historian of technology, but I don't want to be a historian of science either. I consider myself an American historian. Well, he never forgave me for that, right almost till the day he died, although he did finally come around when I had students who were studying how technological momentum ends with systems that have technological momentum behind them. He thought that was pretty good, so then he accepted me back into the fold. But for many, many years, Tom thought I was a defector because I was a historian of science. And I kept saying, no, I'm not really a historian of science. And then I applied for this job at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which was for a historian of American technology. After writing a dissertation on academic chemistry, etc. And I got to the interview with the dean up there, and he said, Tom, tell me, I can't understand here. Are you a historian of technology or are you a historian of science? And I said to him, well, actually, if you want to know what I conceptually really am, I'm an American cultural historian who tries to understand natural knowledge in its cultural context. He'd never heard that phrase before. And that's what I tried to do with my career. I don't want to argue that the taxonomy of the program for this weekend, history of science, history of technology, history of medicine, is an outmoded taxonomy. I don't think it is. And I think one of the great strengths of this program is that it is at least implicitly accommodating to the idea that some of us in the broader population can do history of science, and some of us can do history of medicine, and some of us can do history of technology, and some of us can study gender studies, and some of us can do American cultural history, and Jeremy and I can become historians in departments, etc. I think that one of the great strengths of the program is that it does allow that, even if Tom Hughes never forgave me for becoming a historian of technology. And I think as we go to a world political political economy, what we're doing is really very important for understanding that.
One more question.
So I just had a comment that was perhaps hopeful and forward-looking about the utility of the historical and social perspectives on science, medicine, and technology combined. And it's based on my current experience, which is I've always worked at the intersection of history and public policy. So there's always been, in the medical school, so there's always been an ought or a should dynamic to the work that I do. And in the last couple of years, and particularly this year, I'm co-chairing a National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine committee on how to make equity more than just an afterthought in technological innovation, and what kinds of governance would be needed to make that possible. And in the course of putting together the committee, what is interesting is the preponderance of insight that comes from social scientists. So the people on the committee come from law and sociology and history and philosophy and the sciences too, but it's generally understood that to understand things like the technology life cycle, from funding to design to marketing to understanding its disparate social effects, you need social scientists to understand that. And so it's a hopeful moment, I would say, when you have an institution like the National Academies that thinks that what you need, and relentlessly, historical perspective, as in how did we get here and how should that inform the solutions that we propose. So I find myself in a funny position saying, maybe we're in a hopeful moment because I have colleagues from law and sociology and history and philosophy all trying to figure out what the answer might be. So anyway, just a way of spinning this in a very positive, hopeful, and who knows what we're able to produce.
I think that's a really appropriate closing note, so thank you.